Fill to capacity. Crazy good stories and timely topics. Podcast for people too stubborn to quit and too creative not to make a difference. Inspiring, irreverent, and informative. Stay tuned. Hi, I'm Pat Benincasa, and welcome back to Fill to Capacity. Today's episode, Immigration Law, Outspoken Changemaker in a Convoluted Maze. My guest is Angelo Paparelli, immigration lawyer, scholar, and leader in immigration law. You know, he is often quoted in New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and several immigration law publications. Angelo is a passionate advocate for the rights of immigrants, U.S. citizens, and for organizations petitioning on behalf of immigrants. And most importantly, he is the grandson of Italian immigrants. Oh, and Angelo and I go back a few years when he was in law school and I was in grad school at Wayne State University in Detroit. Welcome, Angelo. So nice to have you here.
It's my pleasure to be here. And Pat, I'm aware of your own appreciation of your Italian heritage, and I've seen some of your artworks in that regard, and I really want to commend you for memorializing the important contributions our ancestors made.
Well, thank you, Angelo. So we're just going to jump right into this. You grew up occupying two worlds, being a grandchild of immigrants steeped in Italian ways, but you were also an American citizen. Were you aware of being in two worlds growing up?
Absolutely. And as hard to believe that it may sound, with more than one Italian sitting on the U.S. Supreme Court. When I grew up in the 50s, Italians were still facing the residual discrimination that existed for decades before that. And I often felt that I was misunderstood, misjudged, because of the rich history of contributions that Italians have made to the world throughout time immemorial. But those weren't perceived. And oftentimes there was a sense that I was somehow affiliated with organized crime,
Yep.
or, the butt of jokes and scurrilous name calling. And so that sensitized me to the importance of defending people who are misunderstood and needing to have their voices heard. And that's, I think, really how I got involved with immigration law.
Well, you just anticipated my next question very beautifully, because I wanted to know did you feel that it was your duty to defend immigration rights? Did that come out of your upbringing, which you just really beautifully spelled out?
Well, there was one particular instance, and I should describe a little bit of my background. My grandparents hailed from two parts of Italy. On my dad's side, they came from a town south of Rome on the way to Naples called Valmontone. And on my mother's side, they came from a very poor region in Calabria, a town, a village really, called San Giovanni in Fiore. And both sides of my family were entrepreneurial, but the far more successful was my paternal grandmother. Her name was Lucia Paparelli, and she started literally with nothing and built up a successful chain of wedding banquet halls throughout southeastern Michigan, known as the Roma Halls. And as I was coming of age as a young kid, my grandmother was well known. Lucia was well known throughout the Detroit area because many people got married there, or they had wakes there, or they had class reunions there. And so she was ultimately, I should say, she was ultimately given the award of Cavaliere d'Italia, a Knight of Italy, by the Italian government. And so I was in my grandmother's shadow, frankly, and somewhat apprehensive about her because she was a strong-minded person and took no guff from anyone. But one day my dad said, Nonna, which is grandmother, Nonna wants us to go with her driver to the immigration building in Detroit. And so I said, sure, I'll come along. And apparently she was going to be sponsoring a relative to come to the United States. And I sat there in the waiting room. They called her name, and a bureaucrat, an immigration official, gave her a lot of grief. They were raising their voice and criticizing her because her papers were wrong. And I'm thinking to myself, oh, this is going to be good. Nana's going to give this person a piece of her mind. And in fact, she melted as if she were the Wicked Witch of the West with water thrown on her. And it just astounded me that someone with, in my world, a lot of power was trembling in the face of the power of the federal government. And so I think that was one factor that led me to be an immigration lawyer. But there were two other things that came about. And if you want me to share those, I
Yeah,
can do it.
please do.
Well, one was that I had the good fortune of being able to travel a fair amount. I had an uncle who had an Italian radio show, and he also had his own travel agency. And every summer when I was growing up, if I had my passport ready, he would charter a flight, Americans traveling on tours to Italy, and he would always save a seat for me, but leave it to the last minute in case he sold the seat. So I spent a fair number of summers in Italy and had just an eye-opening experience. It was very, very different, as you might imagine, from Detroit. I grew up in the inner city, and this was completely different. I got to travel through Europe, and I sort of got the travel bug. And when I decided I would go to law school, I thought to myself, wouldn't it be great if I could see the world as a lawyer? So I started focusing my courses on international business transactions and tax law because I thought that would be a way to see the world. And so I joined a law firm that focused on international business and tax. And I quickly discovered that I would be chained to my desk, drafting boring contracts for faceless, thankless corporations to use to their advantage to save taxes and rarely even being given a thank you. And at the same time, I was approached by the senior partner who was the international business law expert, and he said, we want you to study immigration law. And I didn't have a good impression. That memory
Yep.
of my grandmother left me with a bad taste in my mouth, and I was reluctant. He invited me to go to a conference in Puerto Rico. This was Detroit in the middle of winter, and learn immigration law. So I said, maybe I should give it a fair consideration. Now, I should tell you that by the time I started that firm, I had met and married a woman from Iran. And I thought we were going to move back to Iran. This was before the
Yep.
revolution, and the Shah was still in power, and Americans were welcome there, and the economy was thriving. And I would practice law in Iran, business law in
Mm-hmm.
Iran. The revolution ensued. It didn't seem to make sense. But in the course of that relationship, we ended the marriage after 10 years amicably. And I married again but because I learned Farsi.
Yeah.
And I met a woman from Iran who had just arrived by way of France. And we've been married now 38 years and we have two kids. But the fact of the matter is, those experiences with Iranians caused me to encounter people who had questions about immigration law,
Mm.
and I didn't know the answers. And so I quickly, with those two experiences, geared up and began to see that I had an advantage. Uh, my tax background reminded me that immigration law is similar to tax law. It's based on a code or a statute and regulations, and yet there's a lot of unwritten law. And as a result, I was able to start doing immigration cases. And some of my earliest cases were asylum cases, helping people who were fleeing persecution from their home country. And boy, putting together an affidavit that describes someone's life-threatening fears is far more meaningful than drafting a contract to
Oh, yeah.
save a company taxes. And so I was hooked. And I've been hooked now for 45 years.
Well, you kind of segued into an aspect of immigration law that I would like to bring up. It seems that the laws, immigration laws, are impacted by world events. And I just want to highlight some things. The 1980 Mariel boat lift resulted in the creation of the Cuban Haitian Entrance Program. The 1997 Nicaraguan Adjustment and Central American Relief Act that allowed certain Salvadorans, Guatemalans, and Nicaraguans who fled the violence of their home to file for asylum and stay in the U.S. And then if we go to 9/11, post 9/11, the 2002 Enhanced Border Security and Visa Entry Reform Act, which boosted budget, staffing, and powers for immigration enforcement. And that brings us to the formation of Homeland Security. And then in 2012, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA, gave protection from deportation and work permits to kids who came to the U.S. as minors and lived here since 2007. And finally, in 2017, the Muslim travel ban, a series of Trump executive orders that prohibited travel and refugee resettlement from selected Muslim countries. Angelo, how do you practice immigration law with world events affecting the laws? It must feel like you're standing on quicksand when you practice law.
Well, it is unsettling, I will say the least, because with each new body of law or regulation or change in agency policy, the rules of play are different. And so you illustrated just a few
Yeah.
of the major changes that have occurred in the last few decades, but there are actually many more. We're seeing this now with a program to welcome Ukrainians into the United States. And we we also see, however, that just this past week, President Biden traveled to the border and then on to Mexico to meet with the president of Mexico and Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada and try to deal with some of the flows, the massive flows of people. And it is not an easy situation from a political perspective. I will say that America remains an attractive destination for many, many people in the world. And yet we do have limits on who we can take in. And it is supposed to be based on law. But unfortunately, it is not a law that has been conceived carefully and put together in a way that is comprehensive and intended to address problems. We have problems.
Yep.
We need workers in this country. We have Americans who have foreign relatives who want to be reunited with them. We have people fleeing political persecution and other forms of persecution. And then there are just economic migrants who want to come to the United States and make a better world. And the fundamental body of current immigration law started in 1952, and it was the McCarthy era, if you recall. And that particular law was really focused on keeping communists out of the United States. It created a two-step process whereby you would get a visa from a U.S. consular officer who would be an employee of the Department of State outside the U.S., and then you'd have to prove once again to another different government agent, a border inspector, that you were admissible. And the burden was on you to prove eligibility. And if the officer, either of those officers said no, you weren't getting in. And so that was the basic law that in fact still exists today. We have a concept known as consular non-reviewability. And I call it consular absolutism, but it basically means that the president, the secretary of state, no government official can overturn a visa refusal made by a U.S. consular officer if it is based on a determination of a fact question. Now, if the consular officer makes a legal error, that might be overturned. But the theory was, and this was before modern communication and the internet and global connectivity, but the theory was this was our man or woman on the ground looking at the person and making a judgment. Is this person telling me the truth or not telling me the truth? And we're not going to second guess that. Well, even to this day, that principle obtains in the immigration world. And so many people find that they can't even come to the US. Now, we do have something called a visa waiver program, and with select countries that are seen to have low rates of visa violations, and many people can come for 90 days by just registering online. So it is not as bad as it once was, but you can only stay 90 days. You cannot change your status. And if you don't leave, you will find that you're unwelcome to come back the next time. So,
You're really talking about a system. Almost, I envision this minefield of possibilities that can really stop someone from coming in on a variety of levels.
sure. And those are just what we call the grounds of inadmissibility or ineligibility to receive a visa. But then there are the affirmative elements of proof that you're eligible under a particular category.
Okay.
We have, we would divide the world in the immigration space into three categories: asylees, or people seeking protection or special humanitarian benefits, people coming in by sponsorship under the family immigration system, whether through marriage or family relationship, and then people coming in under what we call the non-immigrant work visas or the employment-based permanent residence or green card status. And we have quotas on a basis of annual limits on how many people can immigrate to the US. And oftentimes, far more people ask to come than the quotas tolerate.
Yeah.
And so the waiting lines, which are based on country of birth, can go long into the future before you ever get to the front of the line. If you're born in China or India or the Philippines, you can expect that you'll be waiting, or Mexico, you'll be waiting quite a long time through the family based system. Now, if you marry a US citizen, or if you're the daughter or son of a US citizen, unmarried and a minor, you won't be waiting quite as long because
Okay.
there is no quota. But everybody else is subject to a quota. And the irony is, and Bill Gates said this once, which it resonated with me, we have work visas that are based on the concept that we have a need that cannot be filled with US workers. And it would help our economy if we allowed people to come in and work based on their special talents, education, or skills. And some of these work visa categories are quota based. And he said, why in the world would you put a quota on very smart and talented people?
Yeah.
We would want more and more of them to come in. And I think he's right. But unfortunately, Congress is at an impasse. And they've been at an impasse for many, many years now. What we see is once in a while, a new law will be adopted, oftentimes coupled with a support of border enforcement. We have a system whereby no one can work in the US unless they can prove their identity and their eligibility to be employed. And that covers US citizens, green card holders, and everyone. So we have a regulatory structure that started in 1952 and has been amended and amended and
Yeah.
amended and amended. So it is a mess. It is
Yep.
dysfunctional. We have Congress several years ago stopped porting the immigration agency that issues immigration benefit. Visa petition, they said, let the user pay. And so, except in some instances, such as people coming under asylum, there are filing fees. And these filing fees can run into the hundreds to thousands of
Oh,
dollars that are intended to support the agency. And unfortunately, the agency, the more money that they get, the longer their backlogs take. And
wow.
so people are extremely frustrated. I mean, if you can imagine your loved one being on the other side of the world, perhaps in a dire circumstance,
Yep.
having a theoretical eligibility to qualify for an immigration benefit, but because the agency that decides these are backlogged,
Yep.
it can take years. I should also mention one other element of
Please.
complexity that people don't recognize. If there was just one immigration agency, it might be okay. It might be tolerable. But there are multiple immigration agencies. There are immigration units within the Department of Labor. There are the consular posts and embassies within the Department of State. And then there are three agencies in the Department of Homeland Security: Two of them involve enforcement, and the other involve benefits. And oftentimes, each bureaucrat or each agency is very protective of their turf. So they tend not to like or cooperate with the other agencies. And that's where someone like me comes in, because we have to understand the rules and
Yep.
interpretations as lawyers of all of the agencies and try to harmonize their requirements so that our client qualifies for an immigration benefit. It's a mess, and it really shouldn't require the services of lawyers in most of these instances. And unfortunately, there are people out there who will victimize their
Yep.
own. So there are people we call notarios or other fraudsters who take advantage of unschooled, naive immigrants, take their money, and oftentimes present false statements of fact that lead to permanent ineligibility for misrepresentation. And so it's a terrible system. It's broken, and as
Yep.
long as Democrats and Republicans are at loggerheads, we won't have any improvements.
So let me ask you, I know you practice immigration law, but you have another Angelo Paparelli front in your approach to immigration law. You started a blog in 2004, and it's called Nation of Immigrators, that today actually influences public policy and has a worldwide audience. Why did you start that blog, and Nation of Immigrators? What does that mean?
Well, this blog was started when Lou Dobbs had his nightly show in which he decried our broken borders, is the way he put it.
Yep.
And it really bothered me that he saw only one side of the story. Now, there have been many followers in the tradition of Lou Dobbs since then on certain networks and certain platforms that have become even worse
Yeah.
in terms of their anti immigrant sentiments. And I thought there had to be a balance in terms of showing the good side of immigration. And when I say immigrators, I would say that I created that word as an all-encompassing term to cover the American people who benefit from the good parts,
Yep.
the contributions of immigrants, the immigrants themselves, and the organizations that want to help them as well. And so we are a nation of immigrators, and very few of us are Native Americans.
Yep.
And so if we trace our roots back enough, we will find that we too faced an unwelcome reception. I mean, it goes back to Benjamin Franklin disliking the Hessian German soldiers, and it continued on,
Yep.
and we could cover the atrocious behavior toward people from Asia, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the internment of Japanese Americans. Our history is replete
Yep.
with constraints and per country prejudice. I mean, let me just give you the example of Afghanistan versus Ukraine. It is, or Haiti, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
Let's take those three countries, and we can even contrast Cuba. Cuba and Ukraine are the beneficiaries of more enlightened, welcoming immigration policies, whereas Afghanistan, a Muslim country, and Haiti, a country comprised mostly people of African origin, are very much disfavored. The same can be said of people born in Latin America and
Mm-hmm.
Mexico, very much disfavored under our laws. And so by being disfavored, it creates an incentive to break the law because the law is stacked against them.
Yeah.
And so I found that, well, let me back up. You asked me about my blog. I pay a fair amount of money every year in taxes to the federal government. And these immigration bureaucrats are supposedly, they are civil servants, and they are supposed to be public servants. And if I'm a taxpayer in an indirect sort of way, I am their employer. And I'm not getting the service as an employer that I believe I deserve. And I know millions of people similarly are being disserved. And so I thought to myself, maybe I can help the government think through the solutions to the problems that they're facing. Some things are just bass awkward, if I could put it that way. And maybe there's a more streamlined way. Maybe there is a legitimate analysis that can be offered under the law to embrace a welcoming immigration policy. And this changes with every administration.
Yeah.
As you might imagine, under the Trump administration, things were really shut down. Under the Biden administration, they're trying to be more open, but they are still facing a flood of cases and backlogs as far as the eye can see. And so I wrote this blog to sort of encourage, embarrass, motivate government officials to do the right thing.
Okay. I want to segue into a different aspect here. Now, you've been called a creative strategist and problem solver in challenging, quote, lost cause immigration cases. Can you give us an example of one of your lost cause cases?
Well, I'm often given a case where someone along the way screwed up, whether it could be the non-citizen himself or herself, or an employer, or a family member, or an unscrupulous or less than competent lawyer, or a non-lawyer, unauthorized practitioner. Somebody screwed up. And what I try to do is identify, because there are what I would call certain provisions of the law that I would call forgiveness clauses, where it's an oops technical violation, but there are reasons why the law should be a little bit more compassionate, a little bit more elastic, and forgive people. And so I will try and dig deeply into the facts of the case and the humanity of the individuals, what their lives are like,
Mm-hmm.
and try to straighten out and present a request to the government to exercise discretion compassionately. And surprisingly, I mean, I don't know who's going to get assigned my cases when I submit them. So I
Okay.
play it very straight, and I try to show respect to the decision maker, but I try to also show the humanity of the case. And frankly, there are instances where if you put yourself in the shoes, this is sometimes I think of it more as psychology or sociology than law. But if you put yourself in the shoes of a decision maker, and your job is to say yes, come in, or no, you can't come in,
Yeah.
or no, you must leave. Sometimes you want to feel good about yourself, that you did something that was right and for the betterment of the country, or you helped someone who was in dire
Yeah.
straits but was otherwise deserving. And so I try to present a psychosocial picture in the context of the law of why and how the government can reach a favorable outcome for my client. Now, I don't
Mm-hmm.
always win these cases.
Yeah.
Sometimes it becomes a really emotional down for me if the cases are not successful. But frankly, I've had very good success in a whole array of circumstances.
Good.
I'll give you one example
Yeah.
that comes up quite frequently. When someone comes to the United States on a visa, that means they're what we call a non-immigrant. They're not coming on a green card, but they're coming either to work or to study or to make art or whatever. And if they show up with that visa stamp in their passport and they approach an international border and a U.S. immigration inspector is there, that inspector will look at the visa and will look at the passport expiration date. And even though the visa might allow someone to come in and say, be here for 3 years and do what they're going to do, the passport expires in 6 months. And so the officer, without explaining to the individual that they're getting a shortened period of admission, stamps the passport with the admission stamp, and off they go. And they think they're back, they're in America, and they can do what they said they could do. They thought that the visa stamp, which itself had an expiration date, was how long they could stay. Well, it turns out that they may not discover it until it's time to extend that visa status, and they discover they've been out of status in a
Oh.
condition that we call unlawful presence for more than 1 year. If you remain in unlawful presence for more than a year, you are ineligible to return once you leave the US for 10
Yep.
years. And so that's a pretty innocent mistake. And it's an understandable mistake. And I've been able to help. Sometimes I'll get a law professor to write a declaration that supports how easy it is to make that
Okay.
mistake. But I've been able to help a number of people in that circumstance. I've had situations where the parents' visas were good, but they didn't pay attention to the kids' visas. And so their children were in danger of being removed. And the children have been in America for a long time now, so they're more American than
Yep.
their original nationality. And they're wondering how are they going to do this? They have to go back because the kids are out of status.
Yep.
So there are a variety of situations where I've been able to help.
So I'd like to shift gears. You touched on it earlier. I would like to talk about immigration and the U.S. economy. Now, according to the Brookings Institute, nearly half of all the Fortune 500 companies were founded by immigrants or their kids, their children. A quarter of all new firms are created by immigrants, which means these firms hire Americans. Now, on the flip side of that coin, I want to talk about the universities. The Association of International Educators data shows that nearly 1 million international students at U.S. colleges and universities contributed $33.8 billion to the U.S. economy during the 2021-22 academic school year. Now, the Trump administration enacted 472 administrative changes that dramatically affected the U.S. immigration system, possibly damaging business and university growth. If immigration helps the economy, why is there such blowback against it?
Well, that is one of the great befuddlements because if you look at traditional notions of Republican values, I'm speaking of the Republican Party, Ronald Reagan, the first George Bush, and the second George Bush saw the connection between the contributions of immigrants and the promotion of the US economy, job creation, greater wealth in the United States. They saw it. They understood it. But over time, the focus has shifted away from that toward the fear that we're being invaded, that we're being replaced by people of unfamiliar backgrounds, of foreign tongues, of perhaps different skin colors. And a kind of nativism or xenophobia has arisen. And so, on one side, the party of business, the Republican Party, has forgotten their business roots and they have instead turned to a kind of nativist interpretation. Now, I don't want to forgive the Democrats because the Democrats make their own mistakes. They create constraints because of the continued effect of labor unions and the perception that if more immigrants come in, then the working conditions and opportunities for unionized workers will be reduced. Both sides have fears and goblins that they seem to be sitting on their shoulders to say, I want to be careful because immigration can bite me. And I don't want my political standing, my reelection bid to be undermined because of segments of my constituency that simply don't like
Yeah.
immigration. And so that's probably a good explanation of why nothing's happening.
Well, you really touched on the next level of this question is that in this country, except for, of course, indigenous peoples, we're all immigrant descendants. And I was going to ask you, do you have a theory as to why we have become so resistant to immigrants now? And I think you're touching on that.
Well, I think we've forgotten our history and we don't really make the connection. The connection is really quite obvious.
Mhm.
I mean, founder of Intel was an immigrant. The founder of Apple Computers was an immigrant.
Right.
He was the son of a refugee. Elon Musk was an immigrant. He's a bit controversial, but still And I believe at least one of the two founders of Google was an immigrant. So you just name these companies and you see the tremendous wealth creation that there has been. But you don't see that. It doesn't register. And
Yep.
why it doesn't register is a kind of selective perception, cultural or historic amnesia.
Hmm.
I don't know what it is, but it is so obvious, intuitively obvious to me. And people often talk about the American dream, and George Carlin said, if you believe in the American dream, you must be sleeping because you're having a dream. But I believe that I'm paraphrasing. He said it in a much funnier way, but the point is, I believe that American exceptionalism, if that term is still to be used, derives from the constant replenishment of human capital, human ideas that come from elsewhere, where people who will do anything to sacrifice for their children's betterment work and contribute in ways that they push it to the level of human capacity. Let's put
Yeah.
it that way. And so when we have that kind of contribution, look at countries like Japan. Japan is facing, and even China, they're facing a crisis that their populations are aging, and
Hmm.
yet they have restraints on who can come in. We have that same problem. Now, you mentioned the universities. Who do you think pays non-resident tuition
Yeah.
when they come to a university?
Yep.
And non-resident tuition supports resident tuition in the public state university system. So we are subsidizing the education of American students by foreign students who come in
Yep.
and do not get to pay the benefit of local resident rates because they're foreigners and they have a residence abroad in theory. So we shoot ourselves in both feet when we ignore our history
Yep.
of what has made America successful.
You were quoted as saying, I dislike bullies and I fight them every day in my work as an immigration lawyer representing clients that are rich or poor, powerful or powerless. Angelo, what energizes you to keep going? What is it?
Well, it's kind of there's a dopamine rush. uh, when I win a case for a very deserving person. And it may be a deserving person who's employed by a company, or it may be a nun. I do pro bono cases, and it could be anyone. But when I see someone who I think is really going to add value to this country, and they're facing what appears to be an impossible barrier to entry, and I can succeed for them. I mean, that just gives me a high. I mean, there aren't many jobs in law where you can really feel good about yourself. I mean, there are some, but I don't know that family law is one of those fields, or tax law is one of those fields, or oftentimes litigation is not one of those
No.
fields, or criminal defense. But immigration law, you really don't have an opponent. What you have is a system of resistance to your desired outcome.
Yeah.
And the one of the fun things about immigration law is it's almost like three-dimensional chess because there are all of these power centers within the federal bureaucracy that that have pieces of authority to make things go well.
Hmm.
And I'll just give you an example. I don't want to name anyone, but there are very unscrupulous organizations that pretend to be legitimate businesses, and they promise to give someone an opportunity to be sponsored for a work visa. And it turns out that with the passage of time, the jig is up. The government discovers that these companies are fraudulent, but it doesn't stop there. It assumes that the people that were enticed to affiliate with these companies are likewise corrupt when they're not
Hmm.
necessarily. They may just be gullible. And so when that happens, that company name is put into an internal database. And every time it comes up and someone's got that company name on its resume, they are going to face adverse consequences. I've seen it happen where people are here for 10 years and their first employer was unscrupulous, but they quickly left that employer as soon as they discovered that something wasn't right. And so for 10 years, they've been contributing, and then the government discovers it belatedly, and they say, oh, we're going to revoke all of your prior visas and leave the country. Now, that's not right.
No.
And those are the kinds of things you have to deal with. Sometimes you have to take them to court. Increasingly, that's necessary. And frankly, a large part of the immigration budget now is in defense of ill-considered or unjust immigration
Yep.
policies. And so it may be that you have to go to a court. And unfortunately, some courts are closed. Some types of cases, the statutes say cannot go to court. And yet, you try to do your best.
You know, as a daughter of immigrants, I can say that this discussion underscores our collective truth and one unbending fact for all descendants of immigrants. There go I, but for the grace of one decision.
An accident birth.
Yeah. Angelo, I want to thank you for being here and more importantly for the passion you have being an immigration lawyer and for taking us behind the scenes of a very complicated US immigration process and the fact that you're in the good fight. So thank you for joining us today.
I appreciate the chance to share this with your audience and with you, Pat.
Thank you, Angelo. And thank you, listeners. If you enjoyed this podcast, hit subscribe and tell your friends. Thank you, Natalie Zett, audio engineer. Bye.